Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Elizabeth Knup with the Carter Center and formerly the chief representative of the Ford Foundation in China. Until just a few months ago, she lived and worked in China for over 2 decades and was instrumental in building civil society in China and from China to the world. Elizabeth is going to share with us a different side of China that's often less understood and underreported in the media. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, Wenqi. Thanks for having me.
So you spent over 2 decades in China working in the business and nonprofit sectors. What do you think are the most misunderstood myths about China, especially from the US and the West?
So, when I was first studying about China, I learned that China was a monolithic culture, that it was very homogenous, and I think that monolithic and homogenous idea about China persists today, not only culturally, but in terms of the politics and the way the society is organized. And I think that is an important myth that we need to unpack and discard. I find China to be a country that is, in fact, incredibly diverse. Individuals within China identify themselves quite particularly in terms of their language, where they grew up, what kind of food they eat, and there's a diverse set of opinions about any kind of contemporary issue that you can imagine, all existing at the same time within China. So I think one thing that we need to, as observers of China and people who want to understand China better, is we need to understand that it is, yes, it's a long cultural history, and it's a unified cultural history of over 2,000 years. At the same time, it is a country that is widely diverse, geographically, economically, educationally, in multiple dimensions, and that means that the country itself is not entirely unified all the time in how they view themselves, how they view their society, how they view their own opportunities. So I think one big myth is this idea that China is some monolithic society. And coming out of that, I think
sorry, a little bit on that point, right? Because I think that's something most people probably didn't think about China or didn't associate China in that way. To help people understand better, would you say sort of the diverse culture, or as you said, people identify themselves as, maybe what province they're from, etc. Does that resemble what's going on in the US in terms of people identify themselves from a certain state? So, is the difference among different states similar to what you were referring to, or is it something different? Just so, people can sort of associate what kind of diverse identity people are.
I think that actually Chinese people identify based on their home province or even town or city within a province even more highly than Americans identify by their state. I think Americans have a much longer history of mobility within the United States. Chinese people are still, I think, even in this most recent generations, are still quite tied to their place where their parents and grandparents grew up or were from. And so there is a strong identity to sort of where your quote hometown is, and your hometown isn't necessarily where you were born. It could be where your parents were born or your grandparents were born, but it is analogous to that kind of a distinction. And then, rightly or wrongly, like in every society, people associate characteristics with different provinces, right? So whether it's a more the society is more vibrant, or it is more educational, or so. And these are stereotypes, but they are also strong identifiers and help people to kind of place each other when you meet someone, kind of to help you kind of figure out who they might be, right? But I think for me, as a student of China, one of the most surprising things to me when I got to China was how strong that is, and what that also then leads to is this question that we have in the West, that China is a collective society versus an individualistic society, the way we look at the US. And I also find that to be an important myth, right? I mean, yes, Chinese society can come together quickly because it has a strong common heritage. At the same time, I find Chinese people to be highly motivated as individuals, right? They're individually trying to make their families stronger and safer. They are individually seeking their career opportunities, their educational opportunities, and they do often make decisions based on individual aspirations, individual interests, needs, etc. And so I think we really, this dichotomy between who's collective and who's individualistic is a myth that's also held in China. China holds the same myth. And I think it obscures the human reality of both sort of the Western societies and the Chinese society.
Fascinating. Well, so really want to know, when you were with the Ford Foundation, you did a lot of work with the society, obviously. And also, in the West, we like to say to build capacity in civil society. What does that really mean? And what are you most proud of? What's really involved in terms of building civil society in China?
That's an excellent question. And I think in the 1990s, when what we would consider independent civil society began to emerge in China. So these were organizations that were developed and organized by individuals and not created by the government. So the 1990s was when these emerged. And as they were emerging, organizations like Ford, which funded them, provided money to them, and other Western civil society organizations that partnered with these organizations really brought ideas about how to organize and run an independent NGO, right? So that's about leadership. That's about how do you build a board? That's about how do you make decisions, et cetera. So some of these ideas about how to create and build a civil society organization did originally come from outside of China and were brought into China in the 1990s. I think by today, we can say that a lot of those original ideas have been adapted to the reality of China, the social and political and economic realities of China. The organizations still exist, many of them. What does
that mean?
So what that means
what does that mean that you have to adapt?
So what that means is that Chinese political culture is one that is never going to give such a prominent role to independent civil society as we have, for example, in the United States, right? It's just never going to be that way. The role of civil society in the total cultural, political, social, economic life of the country of China will never be the same as it is in the US. It's never going to be this kind of
this, right? It's just different. Yeah.
It's just different, right? And so if you're going to be successful in a society, you need to understand that ecosystem and operate within it. So if you're going to advocate for, better healthcare or for, better childhood education within China, that advocacy takes a different kind of form. It's more of a quiet advocacy with the government as opposed to a confrontational advocacy that we might have in the US. So some of the ideas come in. So then the question is, again, how do you help institutions to just build their institutional resilience, their ability to make decisions, their ability to grow, their ability to expand within their own context? And so one of the things that Ford ultimately was able to do was to fund organizations that are Chinese and provide capacity building help to other Chinese NGOs. So it's a Chinese organization that understands the ecosystem and then helps other Chinese organizations to grow and thrive. And so it's more of an ecosystem approach to thinking about how to help civil society be strong and be effective in its own context.
But how do you feel about, after decades of work, trying to build civil society, but it seems like I have to ask this question, the society is closing off, at least, from the narrative we're reading in the media. So does that make you feel somewhat disappointed, or how do you feel about it, this new development?
So I am certainly not going to deny that the space for civil society, both foreign civil society and Chinese civil society in China, is much smaller than it has been in the past. So that is a reality that we can't ignore that reality. At the same time, I was just in Beijing for the last couple of weeks, and I was meeting with old friends and stakeholders and many in civil society. And these people, yes, they are disappointed that progress hasn't been, that the space for their work hasn't continuously expanded, right? That is a disappointment. However, they continue to do the work, right? They get up every day, they do their job, they push forward where they can in a space that's much smaller, anticipating, I am sure, that at some point that space will change, right? Nothing remains static in the world. And so really being close to the ground and being able to see where the opportunities and the space opens up, that is what these organizations are doing on the ground every day. So how do I personally feel about it? Seems that it's really not my particular place to have So my feeling is that what I have done with my career and the people that I know and the institutions that I have worked with, I feel incredibly privileged to have been able to do that. I feel incredibly inspired by their tenacity. I, of course, wish that the space were bigger because they wish that the space were bigger. And it is true that there are organizations that have closed in the last decade that really were, in my view, contributing constructively to Chinese society. And there's multiple reasons for that, including funding, right? I mean, it is still very difficult in China for Chinese civil society NGOs to find sources of funding that are not from the West. And I think that's there. I also feel some disappointment because Ford and others has spent a lot of effort to try to strengthen the philanthropic ecosystem, so helping Chinese foundations to become stronger and more strategic and more able to support Chinese civil society, and that has not happened. So, and we can talk about why, but it hasn't yet happened. And so that also creates kind of a long-term systemic problem for Chinese civil society because they need money.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I mean, nonprofit civil society, you need to have a society that is willing to contribute and believe in the value of those organizations. And so, it's interesting that I, obviously have observed that because of the shrinking space of civil society or funders in China, that Ford Foundation later on actually started helping to build civil society relationship with the global South, as well as, other types of stakeholder relationships, especially in a way, I think it's hoping to bring transparency and responsibility to those organizations and businesses as well. So what are some of the projects and accomplishments that you can share?
Yes, so that is the Ford Foundation itself had a strategic shift, and then also just the reality on the ground in China has caused the foundation to think more about the impact of Chinese economic and political power outside of China. And part of that has been to help stakeholders in other countries, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, civil society organizations,
and these
advocacy
stakeholders
groups.
are
They are either existing grantees of the Ford Foundation in those countries, or they're new stakeholders that the China office identified as groups that need to better understand China, because China is investing in their country and is causing changes in their communities, some positive, some negative, right? And also China's role in global governance is also seeking to engage particularly global South countries in China's global governance agenda. And so in order to understand how to respond to that, it's important for those organizations to have knowledge about China, to have communication, a way to communicate with China and understand China better and communicate their needs. So two projects I can point to quickly. Ford has supported the development within China of what we call an investment grievance mechanism. What this means is the Chinese government and its policymakers set up a process whereby civil society in other countries that have a grievance about the impact of Chinese investment in that country can feed that back into the Chinese system to identify where Chinese investment has been harmful. And the hope is, and this is still
like
examples
of those grievances.
So a grievance might be about the way an environmental impact of an investment project on a community, or a project that's going to displace people from their home, some indigenous people from their homeland, or is going to have a negative labor practice, or hurt women in a certain kind of way. So any kind of grievance like that. And this is a platform that is in development. So it's hard to know exactly how it will work in practice. But the idea is that the grievance gets fed back into the Chinese investment system, and therefore the system can address the problem, number one, perhaps solve the problem, or number two, might be able to make some policy adjustments within China that will cause that problem to not happen again, right? That's the concept, right? And so this idea emerged from Chinese regulators and policymakers understanding that they don't have a good way to understand what's going on the ground all the time. And this is a mechanism and a platform to try to figure out. And then the input of the grievances tend to come from civil society or community organizations or local governments in other countries, right? So that's one thing that so Ford has invested in the Chinese side to build the mechanism and to embed it in their policy framework. We also would provide capacity building to companies and banks so that they understand how to use the tool, and also educate and help the civil society organizations in the other countries to also figure out how to use the tool and then how to make it work, right? So it's aspirational. I mean, it's in sort of early piloting stages, right? So that's one project to talk about. Another one that is kind of related. The other part of this is that, I believe that there are people in what we call the global South that deal with China, I think, have a much more balanced and nuanced understanding about China than perhaps we do in the global North and the West, in the US and Europe, that both notices and recognizes the value of China's engagement as well as the downsides and the potential negatives. And so getting people in those countries to be able to analyze the impact of China in their country from their own point of view, and then to bring that analysis into the global conversation about China, I think helps us all be able to think about China in a more complex way and in perhaps a more realistic way. And so there's a project that we funded at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that has identified over 25 researchers in countries across the global south to write about China from their perspective, and then publish these policy papers, blog posts in both the local language and in English to try to bring these perspectives into the global conversation about China, to just make sure we're being as comprehensive and sort of complexifying a bit the picture that we have of China in the world.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important because, you know, anyone can find that the conversation about China certainly sounds and looks different when you're outside of the US or maybe more European-centric kind of media outlets. You know, that obviously shows a different kind of appreciation, I would say, somewhat, and also just different kind of knowledge and you know, I would say perception of China that is not often how we understand it in the West. And you know, I do want to ask though, you know, as U.S.-China relations turned sour in recent years, what then became some of your greatest challenges working on and in China? Because we know that Ford Foundation has been in China for decades, and it's, you know, one of the first major foundations invited to be in China. But it seems that, again, the space is shrinking, and so the impact and you know, maybe the attitude of welcoming some of the work that Ford used to do is no longer there. So how did you actually handle some of the challenges?
So I think as an American institution that was very instrumental in the 1950s and 60s in the US, funding China studies programs, in the, you know, beginning in 1979, engaging with Chinese stakeholders, and opening an office in 1988 in China. Ford is both a funder of, but also a piece of the architecture of U.S.-China relations, right? And that organization is seen by the Chinese authorities as being a piece of the architecture of U.S.-China relations. So it's very difficult to not be impacted when those relations are either good or bad, right? And so because we're American and because we're so central and understood to be central in the sort of U.S.-China relations, we are impacted. Ford was impacted. I think in some ways positively, because Ford is seen as a channel of continued dialogue between the United States and China. So in some ways, the authorities look to Ford and hope that Ford will continue to fund and participate in exchange and dialogue relative to U.S.-China relations. In other ways, because we're American, because we bring American money into China, that is just a thing that I think the security apparatus in China increasingly sees in a suspicious manner, right? And so really we become more scrutinized about exactly what the money is being used for, who's using it, et cetera. And that's not completely crazy for any country to want to know who's bringing money in and what they're doing with that money in the country, right? So that has, I think, caused parts of the system to elevate their sort of suspicion about organizations, not just Ford, but any foreign organization that's now operating in China, particularly focused on civil society. So the challenge there, on the one hand, has always been sort of trying to be transparent about what we were doing in China and how it was constructive. I think the big thing that changed in the last 5 years is the attitudes in the US about organizations, American organizations that work in a collaborative way with China, also began to bring scrutiny and sometimes critique in the US. And so it ended up that by the time I left the Ford Foundation, we had to be thinking about the political context in both China and the United States relative to the kind of work that we were seeking to do. And so that was,
so this sounds like either side would even, entrust you to be doing the impactful work on the ground. Is that right?
So I didn't quite hear that.
So either side, basically, unfortunately, Ford has become an organization that is not trusted entirely by China or in the US.
Yeah, I would say that there are parts of both societies' systems, largely those that think in terms of national security as the most important part of any kind of work. Those parts of the societies, without really trying to understand, do see something that they need to be worried about in the kind of work that not only Ford, but other American civil society organizations that continue to work with China. I think once you're able to take the time and explain the work in both societies, I think there are also a good number of people who also fully understand, respect, and welcome the contributions that the Ford Foundation is able to make, and not just Ford, but other NGOs that operate in China. So however, the challenge is that to continue to try to do good work, constructive work, that is driven by the needs of the stakeholders, and also manage the reputational kinds of communication issues that now need to be handled, right? Which 10 years ago didn't exist, and now they do. And so that's, I think that's where we all are now. Anybody who is working with China in a collaborative or a engaged kind of way is having to face this this sort of communications challenge, really.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest part, I think, is just the lost trust on both sides, and it's puzzling to me because people always say, building understanding between U.S. and China is essential, and we've seen that effort. Over the last few decades, with, again, Ford Foundation and others trying to do that work. But it seems like the increased exchanges and understanding have not really led to better outcomes, right? So, today's tension and even more understanding have ensued. So what can be done to reverse this trend? Or at this point, it just is impossible?
So I think that a couple things, right? So I actually am obviously a believer in dialogue and communication and ongoing kind of conversation as a way of managing increasing areas of disagreement or, interests that are not aligned. I mean, I think that's one of the fundamental things between the United States and China now. Our national interests are not always aligned, right? And so how do you communicate about that? You have to be in a constant dialogue. And so I think I think one thing we have failed to really analyze is the impact of the COVID travel restrictions. So for almost 4 years, few Americans went to China, and hardly any Chinese people went to the United States. 4 years is a long time. I was one of them, but really, I mean, at a government level, at the important levels, those dialogues, on Zoom for the first year were fine, but getting into year 4, it was really, really challenging. And so that is, I think, something we need to think about how detrimental that was, right? At the same time, we both countries have started to use dialogue as a tool. Like when China is angry with the US, they cancel a climate dialogue, or they cancel military to military dialogues, et cetera. So that is also, I think, both countries, we really need to commit to ongoing, high-level, multi-level dialogue and exchange that we will not cancel when we're mad at each other, right? Because we need to keep talking. And we just had a briefing by Ambassador Burns yesterday at this conference I'm attending. And, there are dialogues now that are in place on a range of issues between China and the US. And people are cautiously optimistic that this is going to help to build back the trust that we are actually quite lacking in the relationship right now. And I really do think that this level of dialogue and conversation is important, but I think it's been disrupted over the last 4 years, and also even longer, by this use of kind of political use of these dialogues to sort of punish the other side for something that we're angry with them for. So I do think that I agree that dialogue is important, and I think we don't have enough of it, and we need to build it back. I also think that it's really hard to build something, and it's really easy to break it. And so I think a lot of things have been broken, and it's going to take a dedicated effort on both sides to build them back. And so you really don't want to break them in the first place, because they're hard to build back.
Yeah, I mean, some people would argue on the US side that, it took the US so long to actually build, right, the trust, and trying to influence China in certain directions, but somehow it's not leading them to behave in the way that we like to see. And so what is the point of engagement, right? What's the point of having a dialogue if they continue to behave in a certain way? So are you still hopeful about US-China relations? And, what are your biggest worries over the next few years?
So I guess I would say that I would want to be careful that that we want countries to behave in a way that we want them to behave, and if they don't, we disengage, right? That seems like not actually, from my point of view, a really responsible way to act in the world, because China is China, right? And it's not going anywhere, and its power is increasing, and it's not going to change its fundamental political nature anytime soon. And so we really need to be able to acknowledge that, and within that framework, figure out how we're going to be able to work together on the planet for the benefit of the planet. And I think that's really, really something that I feel like the US is beginning to kind of get to that place. And I think maybe China is as well, but I think it's going to take a while. And I think there's many things that could disrupt this along the way, right? Many, many things. So I'm hopeful because of the people that I know on both sides who really believe that it is possible for these two countries to not only exist on the planet together, but to actually maybe work together in some areas that are for the benefit of the world. So I'm hopeful that sort of attitude will prevail eventually. What I worry about is that until that time, there's a lot of disruptors, right? There's a possible for some military accident in the South China Sea, or there's the possibility of, just national security concerns really driving demonization. I mean, I think in both countries now, there's a lot of rhetoric that just demonizes the other society and presents very, very incomplete pictures of each other's societies. And these are things I do worry about. So big narratives, mistakes that are going to happen, that are going to cause a chain reaction, that are all going to happen before we get to a place where we are sort of more aligned in how we're going to coexist in the world and potentially work together. So I'm hopeful, and I am concerned in the short term that there are possibilities of disrailment, which brings me back to the importance of ongoing dialogue and conversation, because I think with that fabric, including civil society, including arts and culture, including students and scholarly exchange, all have to be there to kind of create a kind of a web and a safety net that will keep us connected through some probably potentially challenging times in the near future.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us today. I think, as I mentioned, you have brought a different perspective compared to our past guests, and we really appreciate that. I think China is, again, a very complex country, society, and culture that really cannot just use a very simplistic way to understand or describe it. So hopefully there will be more people like you who are committed to building that connection and understanding for the good of, the world, not just for China. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to have you
My
back.
pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks.